And record just goes like that. There we go.
Looks good.
Brent, I guess you ready to have him turn off the lights?
Sure.
Okay. You're the one that turned them on.
There you go. All right. Well, thanks, Coralou, for having me tonight, and I appreciate being here. And it's also kind of you to call me a third-generation Georgetownite. I think that's kind of a stretch since I've never lived here, but I've visited here many, many times. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Hangover Mine. I guess you know that already, and in case you haven't. Whoops. Now I want this to work. Oh, point it at the screen, Dave. Okay, in case you haven't found it, this is the Hangover Mine. It's high above Georgetown, about 1,500 feet up. And it was my grandfather's mine above Georgetown.
Nothing's happening. It makes a ding.
Uh-oh, it gave you a ding.
It was a real mine, though.
I think you need to put another quarter in.
You're touching this, right?
Yeah.
The left-hand one.
Left-hand one.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay, now that we have the technical difficulties out of the way, hopefully.
You have to go back and see Marcellus.
Okay. All right. All set there? Okay. So my grandfather was Marcellus S. Merrill. His nickname was Sally, so I'll refer to him probably as that throughout this, so that's who I'm talking about. And I heard about his mine from a really early age. I've been coming here since I was born, and he talked about it all the time. So let's talk a little bit about how he discovered that mine. And what he would do is he loved to sit in his front yard at what we called the cottage in Georgetown at 11th and Main. And in the 1950s, sometimes early in the morning, he'd look high up upon Democrat Mountain, and he would see a shiny spot that you can see at that arrow. And he wondered, what was that shiny spot? And it would only last for a few minutes, and then it would go away. And so he asked some of the old-timers. A few of those were Henry Nelson, Henry Anderson, Ernest Johnson, Joe Dunecker, Percy Barber. He said, "What is this?" And they said, "Oh, that's Dutch Joe's mine." Okay? And Henry Nelson, this is a picture, I think, in the 70s, so a little bit later than this was. Henry said, "I'll take you there." And Henry was a Georgetown area miner, and as I said, this picture was about in 1970. Okay? This is another picture of Henry in the back, showing Percy Barber, who was a surveyor of the mine in 1959. Okay? So this is a picture from our front yard where he would sit and look at the mine, and you can see this from almost all over Georgetown, and you can see it tomorrow if you want to when you look up here. So this is Democrat Mountain. This is kind of downstream toward Denver. And what you do is you come along Democrat Mountain here along the skyline until you see this tree. Can't hold this very still. See that tree right there that looks, I always thought it looked like a palm tree. It's really weird looking on the skyline. And then you just kind of cruise down just right to here, and that's the mine. And you can see that with your naked eye if your naked eye is sharp. So, okay, and so what happened is my grandfather and Henry Nelson went on up to the mine. And it's easier then than now, but still a hard climb. And the way you do this, it's, as I said, it's 1,500 feet above the valley. you start down here at Georgetown, and this is a little sketch my grandfather drew. And today, of course it wasn't there in the 50s, but today you go underneath the underpass of I-70 about right here, and there's some trailers over here, and there was a road that went up here like this, snaked up here past the Moline Tunnel, Moline Mine, past the New Boston, past, I think that's the Spartan Mine. Then the Moline Trail turned here and went on up over the mountain and actually down into Empire. And that Moline Trail was a main thoroughfare for miners to get to the mines between here and Empire. If you lived in Empire, you came up the Empire side. If you lived in Georgetown, you went up the Georgetown side. And then all of the mines had a little trail, like you can see this one going over to the Hangover Mine, a little trail off of the Moline Trail. And I think this was some sort of cooperative trail where everybody contributed to it because it was big. I mean, it was like a thoroughfare. I don't think you'd get a wagon up there, but it was a wide trail. And as soon as you turn off on, for example, the Hangover Trail, it would get real small. And so that was the Moline Trail. So what you do in the 50s or even in the 60s and maybe early 70s, you could drive your Jeep up to right here at the New Boston, park your Jeep, and then you could start walking along this Moline Trail. That's why I say it was easier then than now, because you could drive up to the New Boston. Okay? So this is just another view of it. This is a 1908 topo. Here's Georgetown. Here's the start of the Moline Trail, kind of going up like this. The star is approximately where the Hangover Mine is. And then it continues on like this, and then drops back down into Bard Creek, and then Empire is on the Bard Creek side. And I show you that because there's two ways to get to the Hangover. One way is right up the front, and the other way is to drive a Jeep up Bard Creek and then kind of come up this road here and get up to the top of Democrat Mountain and then find the trail and get on the trail and walk back down again. Okay? So this is the mine they found, Dutch Joe's mine. This is the earliest picture I have of it. It was taken on June 21st, 1958. And this is what they saw when they got there. The main feature of it is this cabin. They're just over to the left. There's a little bit of a rock cribbing here so that there was a platform here. Right here there was a tunnel, or actually called an attic. And then just to the left of that, there was a dynamite shack a little bit away from everything, so in case it went off, it wouldn't blow up everything. And of course, some mine tailings that went quickly down this steep mountain. And a couple of things to note here, since this is an early picture, there are two stovepipes. One of these is for the cook stove that you'll see in a second, and one of them is for the blacksmithing forge that was inside this cabin. And then also, there's this kind of rock wall here built, and that collapsed in the late 60s. Okay? So this is just another picture, black and white, of course, 1960, very much the same view, but it kind of gives you a little bit of perspective on how this kind of hangs on the side of the cliff. And in fact, you can tell that to build this cabin, they blasted out this area and blasted out a little shelf right here, and then built that cabin so the back wall of the cabin is solid rock. It's not wood. It's just solid rock. So it's three walls. So let's take a little tour of the cabin. When you walk inside and you turn to the left, you see this blacksmithing forge, and you can see off to the left here, and right here, there's a bellows, and of course the leather's all gone, but that was a bellows to heat up probably coal that they brought up here. And then there was this big hood, and they would use that to sharpen mine drills and so forth right on the site. And there's a couple of clues here that you can tell that this mine must have paid. For one thing, the tunnel is pretty long. The other thing is they wouldn't have put this type of infrastructure up there if they weren't making money, I don't think. Okay? So then you walk into the main room, and there was this cute little cook stove that, as far as I know, is still up there. Okay. Over in the left-hand corner, there was a chest that was used to store utensils and coffee. And the chest didn't date back to the mining days. It dated back to my grandfather's days, who thought, I'm bringing this chest up here. So somehow he talked somebody and himself to bring this chest up there full of cooking supplies and so forth. And then there's a little note up here that you can't quite read, but basically that note says, make yourself at home, but put everything away when you're done, because the pack rats will get at it. And case in point, there's this thing up here, and I never knew what that thing was. I never asked my grandfather, I'm not sure why, but it was heavily chewed by pack rats, and it just hung from one of the rafters. Maybe that was to tell everybody that there really were pack rats, I'm not sure. Okay? Then over in another corner, there was some shelves. And when we went up there and sometimes spent the night, you can see some of our things in cans of soup and so forth, but just a few shelves here. One thing to note here is this whole cabin was insulated with this kind of leathery paper, and most of that had been eaten away by pack rats, but there was some left. Okay? And then over here, a little bit more food, a few drinking cups to get fresh water out of the tunnel, which I'll tell you about in a second. Okay? And there were 3 4-pane windows, and you can see we're looking straight down at Georgetown from the inside of the cabin. And these windows, you probably have guessed, are the source of the shiny spot. When the sun was just right, it would reflect off those windows, and then he could see this cabin. There's my house. There's your, very good, very good. Okay? And they were pretty old. They had, a couple of them had that really pretty swirled old glass that I love so much. Okay? And the cabin had some nice things. It had milled doors, porcelain knobs. It was, I think, quite a little place. Okay? This is a picture from way above it, looking down. There it is right here. Here's the lake bed. And this is in 1960. And now you can kind of see why it was called the Hangover. Everybody thinks, oh, it has something to do with drinking. Well, maybe you drink when you go up there, I'm not sure, but it was all about the fact that it hung over the valley. And then my grandfather named it the Hangover Mine. Another one. This is a very similar picture. You can see how steep this thing is. And it's a little bit different. The lake is now filled, and you probably know this, but they built the lake, I'm not sure when, but in 1952 it failed. And when in the 60s, when I was a little kid, we used to drive the Jeep out there and so forth. But by the time this was taken, the lake was filled again. And you can see one stovepipe now, right here, and then that wall had been collapsed. And I-70's there. And I think you could see the start of I-70 in that earlier picture too. But, okay? And like I said, it was steep. And one day I decided with a couple of friends, I'm going to see how steep it is. So I climbed straight up. That's what it looked like. I only did that once. Never again. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about how my grandfather acquired this mine. Once he went there, he decided he wanted it. And so the thing to do was, a lot of the mining claims were available if you just paid the back taxes on them. But he didn't know which mining claims the mine was on, specifically the cabin. So again, my grandfather and Henry Nelson walked up there, and Henry and he spent at least a day, if not multiple days, trying to figure out which claims the Hangover was on and finding old claim corners. And this is the first that I know of many reports. My grandfather was big on reports, and he wrote this report. Later on, as you'll see, I wrote my own reports. But he wrote this report about that whole trip, discussing the possible claims it was on, and you know, over here he's got little pictures of some of the potential claim corners and so forth. Okay? So after he kind of figured out which ones he thought which ones might contain the cabin. Obviously, only one did. He purchased 3 claims for back taxes. And the first one was the Amazon 99, and it was this really long, I think 1,500 feet by 75 feet claim. And then and that one was particularly interesting because it was discovered in 1868, and it was filed upon in 1871, and because it's 99, that's the 99th claim in the Griffith Mining District. So it was a really early claim in this county. Then also Peru 433 that kind of does this, and the Charles H. Moore 817A that does this. And the reason that is 817A is because down in the valley, 1,500 feet below, was the 817B, which was the mill site. So the big plans were build a tramway between the mine and the mill site, but that never happened. So the couple of things to note on here, of course, here's the Moline Trail snaking on up over to Empire, and here's the trail to the Hangover, which my light is burning out, but the trail to the Hangover, and my grandfather called that Jackass Trail. And then, of course, you can see in the middle the tunnel and the cabin. So he never really knew if the cabin was on those 3 claims. So what he decided to do, just to be sure, is he filed his own claim, which was the Hangover claim, in 1969. And that big square outside, you can see at the top right, Hangover claim, kind of encompasses all of that area, and he figured if he could file for that claim and then patent the claim, he would then for sure own the cabin. So he climbed up again with Henry. Henry was a good sport, I think, especially that we're talking 1969. My grandfather was born in 1900, so my grandfather's 69 years old, and Henry was at least 10 years older. I don't know exactly, but anyway, they walk up there and they stake the Hangover claim. And one thing before we move on here. Yeah, I'm fine. Okay. So let's do the next slide. Or just, yeah, okay. Yeah, I know. Slightly confused here, excuse me. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that at that time, you could file for a claim and do a certain amount of work on it, and then I believe it was like you had to do like $100 of work a year, and once you did $500 of work, you could patent the claim. You could file for a patent and then acquire ownership to that land. And that's what his attempt, the reason he filed that claim. Okay? Okay. Go on. Okay, so then a little bit about the actual history of the mine. We know this is supposedly Dutch Joe's mine, but when I was 18 years old in about 1976, I went to the Denver Public Library, the Colorado Historical Society, and the School of Mines, and I did my own research on the Hangover Mine. And as a side note, I think historical research has sort of become my lifelong passion, but that's where I started doing that, and I found the original survey notes for each claim. And these are the kind of the front of those survey notes. And just as an example, on the right-hand one, you can see that's survey number 433. It's filed by Z. Callbaugh and William Mendenhall, and it's the Peru Lode, Griffith Mining District, 1875. And then the others are very similar, except for different people that filed them. And I found other information, like from the mines of Clear Creek County, 1876. It says, about the Peru Lode, this is similar in size and character to the New Boston. It has been opened by a shaft 40 feet deep with numerous pits sunk to the crevice for 600 feet along the vein. Assays have run as high as 90 ounces silver with 70% lead with a trace of gold. So when I was doing a little research for this talk, I looked through my files of Hangover Mine stuff, and I found that little piece in a report that I wrote in 1976 to my grandfather. And I signed it, David Primus, and then he added at the bottom, Assistant Mine Superintendent. Which I figured that was quite an accomplishment. But anyway, through all this research, I never found anything about Dutch Joe or any Joe in any of these documents. So as you can see here, one of the applicants was Robert Old. I mentioned Kalbaugh and Mendenhall. The other one was Talmadge Cherry. And I started to wonder, was Dutch Joe a figment of the old-timers' imagination? And I don't know. But next slide. These are a few of the old-timers. And kind of as an aside here, in the mid-70s, this is about 1975, I think. In the mid-70s, they formed this group called the Miners Club. And they used to go down to the Alpine Inn and have lunch like every Saturday. My grandfather is on the left. He was known as the baby of the group because he was only 75 years old. The other people are older. There's Price Briscoe, F.D. Knight, Walt Anderson, Bill James, Henry Nelson. And I found that fun because being a teenager, every so often my grandfather would invite me to lunch with these old-timers, and I thought, well, this is pretty fun. And, even though they were quite older than I had a good time and met a bunch of the older people in Georgetown. So anyway, about Dutch Joe, I don't think we'll ever know. I kind of wish I could ask him, but I don't think that's in the cards. So a little bit back about my interest in the mine. It really started with this. And this is a telescope, or we called it a telescope. It was actually a spotting scope used in World War II to sight mortar shell landings. And my grandfather bought it surplus somewhere, and he brought it up to his Georgetown house, and it was really heavy. I know that because when I was a kid I couldn't lift it. And he had a little shed built on the side of his house that stored this telescope. And in the summer, he'd pull that out into the yard and set it up, and we'd look through it and we'd see the mine. And this was before I ever went to the mine, but we could see it in the telescope, and I thought, wow, that's neat. And I think from an early age, I was hooked. And by the way, note that tree that you can still see today. That's the spotting tree. So in about 1965, or actually exactly 1965, I know this, my grandfather and my dad and a few of their friends were going to the Hangover Mine. And I was 8 years old. And I remember pretty well, at least this is my memory, that my father said, "You're too young, you can't come along." I was not happy. And my grandfather overrode him. And wow, I was pretty darn happy that I could go up to the Hangover Mine the first time. And as I showed you on that map, we jeeped and then hiked up the Moline Trail. And I saw that mine for the very first time. And I think it's still one of the most special places for me in the Georgetown Valley. So I came home and I drew this map. And I have a few misspellings, but not too many. But you can see over there the cottage in the bottom left, and you see the trailers that are still there today, and the trail. And at the time there was a cable car and a cable, which I think are gone now. You buy some aspen, you cross a stream, a bridge, a gully, you get to the mine hole, and then you get to the mine, which is what I called the cabin. So I thought that was pretty neat. You like that? Original art. So a few years after that, my family traveled to Mexico with my grandparents. And my grandfather we were taking a pleasure trip, but he always combined it with business. And my grandfather was in the automobile industry. And one of his stops was to visit the CEO of Ford of Mexico in Mexico City. And for whatever reason, he took me with him. And so we went to visit this bigwig, and we took a tour of the automobile plant, and then we went into his office, and there, hanging on the wall, was something that looked just like this. Except it didn't say Dave Primus, it said that guy's name on it. But it was a Hangover Mine stock certificate. And here I was in Mexico, and I thought, wow, that's pretty neat. And I knew I wanted my own, and he didn't give me one until I was 17. But he finally did. He actually gave me two, I want you to note. But what he would do is he would give this stock to friends and associates and just take a second to look at it. At the top, the number of shares, and I mentioned I got 2, and I think I was very few people that had 2. It's not common stock, it's uncommon stock. It's located on Democrat Subsidy Mountain. He claims it's 2,000.0876 feet straight up from Georgetown, Colorado. He was only off by 500 feet, even though he went out to the 4th decimal place. Georgetown population 303, people included. Par value unlimited. What can you get? Mineral assets, you name them, we got them. Gold, silver, lead, zinc, copper, magnesium, molybdenum, etc., if you can find them. Wonderful scenery. Lousy roads, the pioneers called them trails. And then at the bottom right it says Sally Merrill, mine superintendent. And in the very small print on the bottom right is officers and board of directors, some of which you may have heard of. For example, we've talked about Henry Nelson, and on here it says Henry Nelson, mining engineer, and as I mentioned, he was a Georgetown area miner. Also on there is Gene Lindbergh, technical writer, and some of you may remember he was a writer for the Denver Post for a long time. Ed Cole, Public Relations, Detroit. He was the president of General Motors. Ed Grossbeck, wild game supervisor. And that was a childhood friend who worked for the Forest Service. And Polly Chandler, writer. And she was author and owner of a Georgetown bookstore. So that was his board. And on the very left it says special dividend. Any stockholder and or visitor will be served coffee by the president. If he is not in, serve yourself. Pure water, dip out of the cistern in the mine tunnel. Please put all coffee utensils back in chest as pack rats are prevalent. Bighorn sheep on surrounding cliffs are friendly, but not to strangers. And I can attest, as I showed you, they're pack rats. They're bighorn sheep. I've seen them up there, of course. And yeah, about 15 feet into the mine tunnel, there's a vertical shaft that's filled with water. And so my grandfather says, well, when you go get water, be careful because it's a vertical shaft. Don't step in there. You know, you have to kind of skirt around it. But it was good to drink. And there, as I showed you, there's a chest full of utensils, coffee, and a coffee pot. And as you may have figured out, as a side note, he was a pretty clever businessman, because what better way to remember this guy than to have this piece of stock?
Right.
And he also did this. This is the same card back and front. Front's on the top, and that's his real business card. He was a electrical engineer and owned Merrill Engineering Laboratories, and that's all the real stuff. And on the back is what he was probably just as proud of, which is his Sally Merrill Mine Superintendent Hangover Mine card. And he's got his little drawing in gold, silver, some rock, and a Georgetown address. Okay, so this is what I thought was coming back there, but basically this is a guide from the 1970s of patenting a mining claim. And as I basically talked all about this, but the basic thing here is that once you filed the claim, you had to do improvements. And so he was always after everybody to help him do improvements. And, I know my father helped with those improvements, and I helped with those improvements. And a few things I remember doing were I helped repair the roof, I carried stuff up there, and I also helped find claim corners. And this is a tree blaze and a claim corner on the right. And the way they do this is they would stack up some rocks and then chisel into the rocks some information about the claim corner, and then they would blaze a tree to make it easier to find the rock. And that's right up above the hangover there. And that was not easy because as you saw how steep it was, it's like on a 50-degree slope. And so it was quite interesting. And as I mentioned, I oftentimes filed a report with the mine superintendent after returning, because that was my duty to do, and so I did. A couple of his other reports from, I've got one here from 1972, and I'll read you a snippet of this. It's hard to read, but one of the paragraphs in here says, "In order to cut operating costs, we expect to manufacture our own dynamite and black powder. We pay all our profits out to DuPont, Hercules, two dynamite companies, when we can make it ourselves. Alfred Noble did." And he's sending these things to his stockholders, okay? Here's one from 1876. Or 1976, right? I got that number on my brain. 1976. "Due to being somewhat decrepit, I have appointed my grandson, Dave Primus, as the assistant mine superintendent at half my salary." Which was zero, of course, but "please write to him about any objections you might have." So that was a couple of his reports. So back to me for a second. Okay? No, forward. So high school trips. This is when I had a lot of fun at the Hangover. And this is a 1975 picture. My brother Chris is on the left with that funny looking cowboy hat on. My friend Tim Smith, myself, and Eric Chips, and we were outfitted for an overnight to the Hangover, I guess you outfitted in 1975, not 1875. But on the left, I want to point out a couple things. We have that big cooking pot that I guess my brother had to haul up there in hand. In the pocket of the green pack is a ruler. And if you knew Tim Smith, you'd know that was typical. I had a lamp down there on the bottom left. And of course, I had my visor because I had my visor everywhere I went in high school. And then we got one of those old-time canteens. So I took a lot of trips with friends of the Hangover. As I mentioned, this trip I spent the night quite a few times. Sometimes it was kind of hard to sleep with the pack rats moving around. But anyway, let me show you some pictures of some of those trips. So that's a picture of the tree that you see from Georgetown. From the cabin is directly below, and that's looking down on the cabin. That tree is actually a bristlecone pine tree, which my grandfather loved because the bristlecones are, I understand, are the oldest known individuals of any species in the world. Like some of them are over 5,000 years old, so he really loved bristlecone pine trees. That's another picture of it, but from the cabin roof up. So you can see that. I don't know how old that is, but it's been around a while. Okay? Kind of out of focus, but there's one of those bighorn sheep jumping around. I really learned how bighorn sheep were sure-footed. One day I sat on a rock.
Oh, wow.
That's me. And one day we went up to celebrate New Year's Eve. As you can see, this is in the winter. The lake is frozen. And the New Year's Eve trip, I would say now was stupid. At the time, it seemed like a good idea, but it was memorable. And I remember we backpacked food up there, of course, sleeping bags, of course, and maybe not so necessary, a case of beer in bottles. And not only did we bring the beer, but we had to bring bottles because it tasted better in bottles. And I don't know, we were stupid, like I said. Okay. We took pictures. This is of the dynamite shack that I mentioned. That was just down the trail a little bit. We took pictures of stalagmites inside the tunnel. So those are just, ice stalagmites. I thought they were really pretty. The whole trip, as you can see, was super cold. We built a fire in that little cook stove, and we stoked it all night long, and it still didn't keep up. We were freezing all night long. And the worst part is that we'd open the beers, and if you've ever opened a beer when it's really cold, what happens is they instantly turn to slush, and they leave a little alcohol at the bottom, and you don't want to drink them anyway, so the beers were a wash. Anyway, okay? So another time, this is not in the winter, we ventured into the mine entrance. That's what it looked like in probably the 70s, okay?
How deep was that?
What's that?
How deep was that?
It's about 150 feet to a cave-in, so it was deeper than that. We went past the cistern, and it's kind of hard to see, but this is where you got the water. You're looking at very cold water there, and there are some logs on the left that you can walk on to get past this vertical shaft. Okay? And then we continued walking along the tunnel. That's what it looked like. Okay? And we went all the way to the end and looked out the mouth of the tunnel. And that trip, maybe all trips, we only went back there once or twice, but we got to the very back of that tunnel, and the bats thought, hey, wait a minute, this is our home, not yours. And the bats would fly out of the tunnel, and then they'd fly back in, and they'd fly straight at us until they'd get right here, and they'd flip-flop. And then they'd go back out, and I couldn't find the picture, but I had my camera with a flash, and I took pictures of these bats doing these acrobatics. I'll never forget it. But anyway, go on. We took a selfie before we knew what selfies were. Okay. We went back outside, and for some reason that was my uniform of the day. I'm not sure why. But we had a lot of fun that day because my grandfather had the remains of a gross of M80s in the cottage. And there weren't very many, but there were enough. And so we packed a few of those up there, and then we took a piece of stovepipe, and we took a coffee can, and we made the stovepipe like a cannon out over I-70, and put the coffee can in the end, and the M80 in the bottom, and kabam, and that coffee can, I might have hit a car, I don't know, but it went way out there. I tell you, we had fun. Okay. So, maybe that same trip, I'm not sure. As you can see, that's July 11th, 1975. My grandfather was real into Morse code, so he and my brother, who didn't get to go because he was too young, went down into the dry lake bed with the Jeep, and at a prearranged time, we started exchanging Morse code from the mine down to the lake bed. And this is my brother's report. And as you can tell, I don't think we were very successful. I guess we got an R up there and an S and a T, but...
You're using mirrors?
No, we were using flashlights. It was dark. It was night. Yeah, it was nighttime. But I don't think we were very good at it, but we had a good time that time. Okay? And another time, my brother and I packed up suit coats to take an unusual picture for my parents. It is. That was fun.
And they got their cousins to take their fine dresses up there too.
Oh, that's right. Much later. Yeah, right. And that sign right there says Hangover Mine. That's one of the many signs. Okay. So about this time, mid-70s, my grandfather and his friend Ed Grossbeck, and I mentioned Ed, he was the Forest Service guy, the childhood friend of my grandfather, both of them 74 years old, decided they wanted to go to the Hangover maybe one last time. And so we did that. And in about 74, 75, the road was trashed, and we couldn't drive up to that first mine. So my grandfather says, well, I know another way. It's easy. We just go to Empire, and then we drive up the Bard Creek Road, and we stop at the top, and then we just walk down. And Ed Grossbeck says, you know, Sally, he says, that's the worst road I know in Colorado. And I said, you know, I was 17 years old. I said, oh, I can do it. No big deal. But they were right about it being terrible. So we drove to the top of Democrat Mountain, and we parked, and this is where we were getting ready to get on the trail. And this is at the trailhead. And so on the left is Ed's daughter, Barbara, and myself, note the visor. And Ed Grossbeck, note the pipe, that's always in his mouth. My brother's down low, and Ed's grandson is there, and then Ed's son-in-law is on the right. So the deal with this trip is we plan to stay at the Hangover overnight. So we walk down the trail, classic picture of Ed with the pipe on the trail. His daughter is kind of smiling, so things were okay so far. Yeah, she hasn't seen the accommodations, right. And the trail, if you've ever been on this trail, and even in 74, is almost non-existent because no one ever goes on it, so it's filled with trees, and you have to step over trees and stuff. Anyway, we go down this trail. I'd never been down it before. I was following my grandfather. And we had no GPS, of course, at the time, and we got incredibly lost. So, next picture. This is a picture of my grandfather looking disgusted because we are so lost. And he was not a happy man. And the other thing is, we carried no water. Why? Because there's a cistern. Right? We're going to get to the Hangover Mine, and there's going to be plenty of water. So we had no water. We were completely lost. The old-timers were really tired. And so we kind of make our way back to this mine called the Buckeye Mine, which is between the Hangover and the top of the mountain. Pretty big old mine. And we remembered at the top of the mountain where the Jeep was parked, there was a couple of pools of water. And there was also a stove, an old stove at the Buckeye that had a little bit of water in a piece of it. So we walked up, the younger people walk up to the Jeep, get some water, and we laid down on the mine dump, and we slept a fairly fitful night. And we woke up to this sunrise, which I decided to take a picture of. And I'll never forget that morning, because with that water, which we didn't get sick from, but we made buckwheat flapjacks and right there, and cooked them up right there on the Buckeye Mine. And we had a pretty good time, but we never got to the Hangover, and that was the end of that trip. So then we get to this phase of disgruntled stockholders meetings. And so, as I said, he would send these reports out to the stockholders, and he would always report, sorry, 0 dividends, maybe next year, blah, 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 blah. And so he started having disgruntled stockholders meetings, and this particular one is in 1982, was the 78th annual, supposedly, disgruntled stockholders meeting. And of note, you can see that is a picture of the east portal of the Hangover Mine, which I think is because sometimes they did this in Idaho Springs. And so I think that was, his drawing for the Idaho Springs ones, but I'm not sure. At the bottom it says mine superintendent and crew, and that would be Rainbow, Sarah, who's the burro, and Sally, my grandfather. So next picture. And there they are at one of the disgruntled stockholders meetings. They were obviously real. My grandfather's on the left, and Sarah's in the middle, and Rainbow is on the right. Okay. So this is an invitation to that same one, and of note, you can see there it says Sally Merrill, mine superintendent. Rainbow, good luck Indian girl. Okay. Sarah, head borough, second jackass. He's referring to himself there. And in the middle, opening address and keynote speaker, and it says no production, no layoffs, no gold, no silver, no dividends, yet again. Sally Merrill, mine superintendent. Okay. This is the 77th annual, so the year prior, in City Park. And I think he'd have quite a bit of fun with this, because he would invite all of his friends over for this disgruntled stockholders meeting, and I think they'd all have a great time. And I don't know if Henry Nelson was at any of these, but I want to read you a quote from Henry Nelson, because I think this represents what a lot of people felt. Henry said in 1974, "Everyone makes fun of Sally's Hangover Mine, but it is one of the most unique old mines in the West. When you think, I guess it was Dutch Joe carved a niche of that rocky cliff 2,000 feet above Georgetown, in that space built a cabin, it overwhelms you to think the amount of energy it took. He had to drill by hand holes into that cliff, and by means of drill rod support the beams that in turn has held the cabin there for the past 70 to 80 years. It is a good example of the perseverance of the tough prospectors that made the state of Colorado great for its yield of gold and silver." So I think that kind of represents the meetings, okay? So many people, many of you, I see by the raised hands earlier, visited the mine, and I want to show you a few pictures through the year of those people. The first one is my father, Bob Primus, on the left. Next to him is Paul Puterbaugh and Henry Nelson in 1960. This is the Wren family from Steamboat. Gordy and Gordy Wren on the right, and I assume... I should write that down. Okay. Gene? Okay. And that's 1962. Okay. That's my grandfather in 1964, and he's got a big old camera with a telephoto lens, and I think he's looking pretty happy in all of these. Okay. This is my grandfather and some friends on the Moline Trail, 1964, and I think that's a good view of the Moline Trail. You can see how wide of a thoroughfare it was. Okay. My grandfather in 1967. My friends, Jeff and Russ, cooking something up on the stove in 1975. Okay. And this is a 2003 trip with some of the people you might recognize, some of our Georgetown friends. And I believe I've got these right. On the left is Ted Schmaltz and myself, and that's my daughter Kristen next to me, Buff Rutherford, my brother Chris, my father Bob, Cynthia Skeen, Mike Moore, kind of can't see him, and Bill Wilson. So on that trip, we drove up Bard Creek, we went down the trail, and mostly didn't get lost. We had a GPS that time. This is all of us at the Buckeye Mine where we spent that night in 1975, looking at the Buckeye Mine a little bit. Finally, we find the mine after we got a little bit lost, and you can see the mine off in the distance and the group looking at it. Okay? And this is one of my favorite pictures. That's, of course, Buff talking to my brother Chris, and right inside the entrance to the mine. And also one of my favorite memories, because well, I worked to get all these older people, Buff specifically maybe, down to this mine. We all made it. And then he gets there and he opens up his jacket and he's got a canister of oxygen underneath of his jacket. I guess he smuggled that because he figured that if he displayed it earlier, I wouldn't let him go or something. I don't know. And then he said, you know what, Dave? I can't make it back up out of here up to the top. He says, I'm going down the front. And I said, man, it is not an easy trail. It's almost gone. And he says, no, I'm going down the front. And I figured, well, you're going down the front. So I sent my daughter down with him, and they all made it, and we made it. And so, okay. So there's all of us hiking out while my daughter and Buff were going down the front way. This is 2011. My nephew Quincy and some of our friends went up there. And oftentimes people that went to the Hangover Mine, myself included, would carve these signs. There's one that says Alex, Dave, and Chris and Tim on the very left. But some of these, like the one Ken First and Mark, whatever, I can't read it, we don't even know who they were. But a lot of people visited the mine, and everybody seemed to treat it with respect, and oftentimes made these signs. Okay? And sometimes I'd find notes like this: thank you for everything, 12676, Jim and Don, whoever they are. But it's kind of neat to think a lot of people visit that mine, and probably still do. This is my last slide, a sketch my grandfather made in 1955. And the rest of the story is when my grandfather died in 1986, my grandmother gave Chris and I the three patented claims. The Hangover claim was never proved up and patented, so that was worthless, I suppose. And we kept those claims for a while, and then later donated those to Historic Georgetown in 2006. And we're glad to do that. And one of the caveats was they said we could visit it any time, and we have. So we've had a lot of fun, and that's my talk. Thank you.
Last time.
Thank you very much. Carla asked the last time, and I'll bet
2011.
I think it was that 2011 trip, so it's been a while since I've been up there. But my next door neighbors keep telling me they want to go, so maybe I'll have to do that.
Did you ever find anything to say how much they took out of that mine, or whoever took it out, if anything?
I really have not, and I don't know where records like that would be. I don't know, and maybe they exist, but I've never found any, and I also to this day don't know which claim that mine is on. It was probably one of those three, but I don't know.
With GPS now, next time you go up, let me give you the program where you can go and just overlay on the...
Oh, that's a good point. I know exactly where it is, so maybe we'll do that without even going up. Because I have a GPS point. That's a good point. Yeah. Right.
Are the windows still there?
Yeah, most of them.
Well, actually, you can do it on the county website. We got
Oh, well, I'll just go home and...
Yep.
Yes.
Do you know when it was in operation?
Well, I would guess 1870s, 1880s, something like that. I don't know how long it was in operation. I have really no idea. It may have been later than that, for all I know. I mean, I'm just thinking, but in the 60s it was in pretty good shape. That cabin was in pretty good shape, so maybe that means it was operated in the early 1900s. I don't really know.
Is that Moline Trail what we sometimes call Union Pass now?
No, it's this side. I mean, it's up valley from Union Pass.
It's really up above the trailer court.
Yeah.
As you come
It's-
into town. I mean, it's more that way, yeah, an entrance. But
Where you go, where the underpass is at I-70, where it starts, and it kind of snakes up to the right if you're looking at the underpass, and then Union Pass is down about, a mile or mile and a half, something like that. Yeah.
I just have something I wanted to share.
Sure.
In 19 1982, I think it was. I was talking about one day about some stuff around here, and he was telling me about the Hangover. And he said, and he was trying to point it out to me in the middle of the day. But he said, if you come to sunrise service on Easter, right at the time the sun comes over the hill, it hits the window up there and you can see it.
On Easter, really?
So I went to sunrise service. Now, I was not one going to sunrise service. But I went to 3 of them after that. Did y'all see the...
Is that right?
But it was great.
Well, that's a pretty good story. I'll have to keep that in mind.
But it was really great to see at that moment when the sun came over the ridge on
Yeah.
the Maxwell side, that it hit that window.
I'll be darned.
Well, it was your star in the east.
Yeah, well.
Did Dutch Joe live up there?
Well, I don't know if Dutch Joe even existed for sure, but somebody lived up there for sure, absolute certain. I mean, you know, they had a cook stove, they had their own forge, they obviously came down for supplies, but that's why they built that cabin. They absolutely lived up there. And I don't know if it was one or multiple people. It could have been multiples. It was, you know, I know it's kind of hard to get an idea, but it was about, the living space was probably 10 by 12 or something. It was big enough for more than one person.
Well, and the amount of work that they did.
Yeah, and the amount of work that they did. The fact that they had the nice doors and the door and the window and the insulation, they lived up there for sure. Yeah.
I want to know what the stock is worth. I still have one.
I don't know. You could lodge a complaint with the assistant mine superintendent. I'd like to know what mine's worth too. Well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.